So before we move forward, I want to define a few terms. This workshop is called Jung's Map of the Soul. So I want to define what I mean by soul, first of all. So the best definition, the shortest definition for soul is the totality of our inner life and its relationship to our outer life experience. Okay. So soul is not just like this ethereal or intangible thing that kind of lives inside of us, right? But it is, and it's much more than that. So it's the totality of our inner life. So this can really include emotions, fantasies that excite us, fantasies that terrify us, judgments that we have of ourselves and others, hidden stories, messages, memories, right? These are all things that kind of impact how we live our life and how we both inwardly and how we then engage our life outwardly. When you read the word psyche, we might run across that word. You can read soul. Okay, because psyche is actually the Greek word for soul. So when we talk about psychology, we're talking really about the study of the soul. So it's wild to me, having spent most of my life in Christian higher education, seminaries, psychology and spirituality have been divorced. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense. That's a new thing relative to the history of humanity. Soul, psyche, these are all interchangeable. And map. So let's talk briefly about maps. I want you to, if you hear nothing else about maps, they're an approximate representation of a defined spatial area and its various elements for the purpose of navigation, knowledge, and relationship, right? So all maps are approximations. I want you through this workshop to orient towards your soul, not to Jungian theory, not to Jung's map. I want you to orient to your own life. Okay. And these paradigms, these definitions, these terms can be really helpful that will engage, but ultimately it's important that you come back to yourself. Now, that doesn't mean you don't learn new things and step into them and be like, maybe there's something to this and I don't want to engage it, but I feel like I need to. That could be, but ultimately it's about orienting towards yourself. And maps are tools for experience. Maps are not the experience, right? So you can understand shadow and ego and persona, but my hope is that you would actually be able to see how those things play out in your everyday life, your relationships with your partner, work, kids, your own inner thoughts. Like, I want you to be able to make those maps help your experience to make more sense. Okay. And also there's many types of maps, right? So for a single defined spatial area, you can have different kinds of maps, right? You can have topographical maps, you can have political maps, maps that lay out transportation systems, agricultural maps. So in a given situation, you're going to need different maps. The Jungian map, if you will, is a map that really allows us to understand motive, to understand what is hidden, that is ultimately animating our life. By the way, the word animation comes from the Latin, which is where we get our word for soul. So anima, if you've heard, you've probably seen this. We might touch on this in this workshop. But this is one of the Jungian concepts, is the anima, which is the animating element of our psyche. Okay, clear as mud. Here we go. All right, so you understand soul, you understand map. So there are also well, it's a question, right? So why do we need a map of the soul? Okay, why do we need this? So first, maps help us know where we are, right? You are here, right? They orient us to where we are right now, which is really essential, right? If you pull out a map, if you're in the United States, I'm in Oregon right now, right? So I pull out a map. Before I moved to Oregon, growing up in Tennessee, it was, the western part of the country might as well have been Mars, right? I didn't know anything about it. I'd never been there. My orientation to this map of the United States was Tennessee and maybe south of that because we went to Florida on vacation, right? But north, I didn't really know much about. So they help to locate us. And now when I look at a map, I'm like, okay, I know this larger map. I know what's happening. I know where I'm at. I know what it would be like to be over there, but they help to orient us to where we are now. And then maps help us know where other entities are and how to get to them, right? So when we drove from Tennessee to Oregon, 10 years ago, we used a map in order to help us get from out there back in Tennessee all the way to the West Coast. The inner life can feel dimly lit, by the way, but maps help to illuminate the paths around us. Okay. So as we understand this map that Jung has laid out, we start to, it's not about understanding those terms as much as it is about understanding how those things manifest in our own lives. And then maps help us to return. I mean, this is huge, right? Like if you want to navigate out into a dense dark forest, getting back is as important as getting into that, right? So shadow work is not just about diving into the depths and then living there and never resurfacing, right? Shadow work is actually about building a relationship between the unconscious life and our conscious life. And in order to transcend or to descend and ascend, right, in and out of those worlds, we need to be able to navigate into them and then navigate back out. We can get lost, right? We can get lost in the inner life, and that I've seen that happen where people get so sucked into the inner life, and it's almost as though they completely flip the script where they were living above and not concerned with the unconscious, and now they're entirely immersed in the unconscious and can't find their way back out, and that's also not healthy. So here's our map, and allow me a moment to orient you to this map. So first of all, the white space represents the bounds of your personality. So each person listening to this, you can assume that the white sphere, the larger white sphere, is your entire psyche or soul. The green space represents the totality of what is not your personality. But you can potentially interact with what's out there, right? So above that horizontal dotted line, we can say that's the line that divides the conscious self from the unconscious self. And so everything above here, your outer life, right? These other people, they are not you. That's a whole workshop in and of itself. But the outer life is, you know, the people, the spaces, the events, experiences that you have, that you experience, that you engage, but ultimately can only be related to. You cannot become them. And the same is true in the inner life. So through dreams, through active imagination, through synchronicities, I mean, you name it, right? The things, the mystical experiences with the divine, you know, these are all things that can happen in the inner life that we can engage, but ultimately are outside, right? They're outside of the bounds of who we are, right? And so the point is not to bring all of the unconscious into our own individual soul, right? The point is to be able to relate to it and to have relationship with our unconscious, okay? I already mentioned the great divide, right? The horizontal line between the conscious and the unconscious, but everything you can, you know, the terms that are above that line, those are terms that are concerned with the outer life, you know, ego, persona, those are more outer life focused. And whereas shadow and anima and animus are more concerned with the inner life. So let's start with this term ego. Okay, so this gets tossed around quite a bit. We're going to start with ego. So first, ego is the center of the field of consciousness. So our conscious personality, you can think of it like a solar system, right? There's a lot of things kind of rotating and revolving around it. And the ego is in some ways the centerpiece that is pulling it all together and holding it all together. Okay, it's the center of that gravitational field. And for anything to become conscious, it must be drawn into the gravitational field of the ego. So you've heard, you know, the term self-awareness, right? Or, you know, yeah, well, we'll just stick with self-awareness, but that's synonymous with consciousness. So when I say consciousness, you can think about self-awareness. It is an awareness of the ego, of who it is and who it's not. So the ego's begins forming in childhood and continues forming really throughout life, but most intensely in childhood and the first half of life. And it's formed primarily through our experiences and our relationships, and especially primary relationships. Okay. So parents, caretakers, teachers, coaches, siblings. Ego's formed through these relationships, through these experiences. And you can think of the ego kind of like a quality assurance manager. Okay. So, you've got at the end of an assembly line, the quality assurance manager standing there and kind of, saying this is good. This can go out onto the sales floor. This can go out to the consumer. Oh, that's not good enough. That's broken, or there's something defective. So this needs to go, and be discarded, or it needs to stay in the stock room. It needs to kind of, maybe discounted, but we'll put it in the back for now. Right. So the ego functions to basically decide what gets sent out into the world. What do we present? What do we not just present to others, but what do we even present to ourselves? What is too painful and too unacceptable to even accept in ourselves? Certainly what's going to not help us get our needs met by our parents, teachers, siblings, coaches. What's not going to help us? If those things are not going to help us get our needs met, they'll go into the back room, which you can probably imagine is shadow. We'll get to that in a second. Ego is also the seat of action, choice, purpose, and meaning making. So to understand our ego, we must utilize our ego, right? If I am aware that I am aware, this is the ego conscious of itself. Okay. Ego is necessary for relationships and necessary for connection. If you want to be in relationship with someone, lacking an ego is not going to help you. Not having an ego, getting rid of your ego, not, I don't want to be egocentric. Well, that's problematic, right? Those are some of the ways that ego gets a bad rap, egocentric, egotistical, and egomaniac, right? People who have an ego it gets kind of conflated with this like bigger than, larger than life, like there's no room for everyone else. But really, someone like that actually has a very small ego, right? And that's why they're taking over everyone else's space. That's why they are putting other people down. That's why they don't seem to care about anyone but themselves, because ultimately their sense of identity is so small and they have so little access to who they are that they're having to actually take it from others, right? Extract that meaning, that purpose. They have to enact themselves onto others in order to feel a certain sense of solidity, because it's just not naturally there. Murray Stein, I'll say so tools, and the ego is a tool for self-reflection and awareness. And I already mentioned, I got a little ahead of myself there, but the ego, you need an ego in order to continue to grow your ego. And that comes online just naturally when we're young, and we start to build that greater sense of awareness, and it kind of like a snowball gives us the strength to move to that next thing, right? So ego consciousness is not something that just suddenly happens. It's something that we do over the course of life, particularly the first half of life, as we are forming a sense of who we are. Murray Stein, by the way, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but this course or this workshop is from Murray Stein's book, Jung's Map of the Soul. And Murray Stein is world-renowned Jungian analyst, comes from a Christian background, actually, but really found that Jungian psychology went further in terms of helping to integrate the unconscious. I certainly agree with him. But this book is, and I highly recommend it. But he writes in his book, he says, the ego is a mirror in which the psyche can see itself and become aware. It is the mirror, right? The ego is a mirror for us to see ourselves more clearly. It's a tool for investigating the soul. Having an ego is a prerequisite for inner work. I would not recommend, inner work, shadow work in particular, for anyone that is, not in the second half of life, and that can be at different ages. But there are people like, hey, let's do shadow work with kids, and that's just simply not helpful, because the developmental task for a child is actually to form an ego. And if you're doing that and you're trying to bring forward what is not acceptable back into consciousness, it doesn't allow that developmental stage to take place. Best case scenario, we're all going to have a shadow, by the way. We all need to develop an ego. It's about leaving room for those things to be reconnected later on. And I know I'm using shadow, haven't really defined it yet, but we're about to do that. So let's jump in here. We'll actually talk about persona and shadow together because in some ways they're like opposites. So keep in mind, we've done ego here, and you can see that there's these dotted lines that kind of run from ego down to shadow. And then at the same time, ego and persona are in the same sphere. So you'll kind of understand that a little bit more as we go. Murray Stein in his book writes, the shadow is the image of ourselves that slides along behind us as we walk toward the light. The persona, its opposite, is named after the Roman term for an actor's mask. It is the face we wear to meet the social world around us. Plato has a quote. The short of it is just, I think, so profound and so clearly Jungian, but he says, every light casts a shadow. And the closer we move toward the light, the greater the shadow is that we cast. This is an image of persona and shadow, right? So if we try to move towards the light, right, this very thin, persona-driven image of ourselves, we cast an even larger shadow, right? So that's why the persona and shadow are somewhat opposites. The more illuminated we try to be, the more illuminated we try to present in the world, usually the opposite is taking place unconsciously. And the more we're having to push down and be unaware of in order to maintain that very one-sided image. So let's dive into shadow. Shadow, first of all, if you hear nothing else, shadow is not good or bad. It is simply a container, okay? You can think of it like a bag. Think about the bags you use in any given day, trash bags, grocery bags, backpacks. Like, think about how helpful they are. They help us to put a bunch of stuff in it that we truly do need, and they help us carry those things, and we don't have to really think about them, but they're still there. And then when we need them, we can bring them out of the bag, except for maybe the trash. But again, have you ever been in a situation where you didn't have a trash bag? The chaos of like, okay, well, I'm just stacking these little pieces of trash on top of each other until we get a trash bag. It's an absolute wreck. It's a mess. And it's a house of cards. Someone knocks it over and it's just like you've created a massive mess. So bags are helpful. Containers are helpful. Shadow is not good or bad. You can think of it like an organ, really. You need a colon, you need a gut, you need, I guess that's probably, gut is a different way of talking about colon, I guess, but you need a heart, you need a brain, you need, your nervous system. They are things that we have and that enact involuntarily, and the same is true about shadow. Okay, so there's not a situation where we don't have a shadow or where we don't develop that or where we can even empty it. It's about relationship, right? Shadow is also what we hide, repress, and deny. I think that's the best definition for shadow out there. Shadow is essentially what we hide, repress, and deny. And you could add the phrase, or what we fail to see or know about ourselves. Okay. So it's not always that we're certainly not consciously hiding, repressing, and denying. Okay. When something's in shadow, it's because we've put it there unconsciously. We're not aware that we've done it. Okay. Once we're aware that we've done it, that's actually a step towards integrating it. Okay. But things can simply just be out of sight, right? What's behind me right now, I can't see it except, I can see my own reflection in my Zoom room. But if I didn't have that, like I couldn't see what's back here. It's a way of thinking about shadow. It's just out of sight. It's out of our peripheral vision. Okay. Shadow consists of undeveloped instincts, emotions, desires, and hidden messages. These are really some of the core elements of what exists in shadow. Instincts, emotions, and desires are things that as children, they come out very naturally, right? Kids have an instinct to take their clothes off. My 6-year-old son will just, take his clothes off and run around the house. There's an instinct there. There's something like very instinctual about that. Same is true with emotions, right? Emotions are not things that we consciously have. We don't choose to have them. They are things that actually rise up from within us. They really are part of our inner life. But they're the things that also can really be disruptive in relationships. So we'll often find that, and I would even say the work I do with so many, we start shadow work with emotions work because it's often our emotions that are in the bottom of that bag, right? They're the first things that go into the shadow because as children, our anger, our sadness, our fear, I mean, even our joy, these are things that the adults in our lives can really speak into kind of a repressed place, because we don't actually know how to, we don't know how to communicate those emotions when we're young. So they just kind of happen. They're instinctual. And then, we scream and we yell, or we kick our brother, we, hit mom. And then we're like, you can't do that. That's bad. Right. And so we can take that emotion, and depending on the child, if you're highly sensitive, that can be almost devastating. And maybe you'll never show your anger ever again. So that's important to remember, is that when we're dealing with shadow, we're dealing with undeveloped parts, right? Primal, instinctual. And so I got a dinosaur and a blob monster. These are things that are not, that the ego sees as bad. The ego sees them as, oh, that's the part of me that I cast away. And because it stayed in shadow, it's just undeveloped. So we have to spend time developing them. Also, shadow is not evil. Okay. It's just hidden. So when you think about the relationship between shadow and ego is like the moon, and shadow is like the dark side of the moon. It's just the hidden side of the moon. It's the side of the moon that is not illuminated, that is not facing the light. Shadow and ego are parts of one another. They're the same thing. It's just that shadow is what we are simply unaware of in ourselves. Shadow is not synonymous with false self. Okay, these terms have been kind of conflated, I think, in popular vernacular and certain authors. I think Richard Rohr uses the term false self quite a bit, and he's been very helpful for me in entering into Jungian psychology, actually. But the false self is not the shadow self. Maybe more clearly, the false self would be more aligned with the persona, right? The part of us that we put out there. But it's, again, a persona is not even false. It's just narrow. It's thin. It's one-dimensional. It's not a robust depiction of our totality. It's just like a little pinhole into our personality. So it's not untrue. Okay. It's not false. Shadow work is integration, right? It's not about elimination. Shadow work is never, ever, ever about eliminating. Okay. Now, we may eliminate the things that we do in life because of what's in our shadow, right? If I think that I'm just like an absolute burden to the people around me, if that shadow message lives inside of me, and I'm always burdening people, and I'm always in the way, and they don't really have time for me, and I shouldn't, promote myself. I shouldn't really assert, what I want. If that is a shadow message, then it is going to create an external world, maybe a persona, that is highly accommodating, going above and beyond all the time, never feels like it can be taken care of, always feels like it owes everyone else. Someone does one nice thing, and that's really unbearable, because it's like, well, this is too much. You're giving me too much, right? So I now have to go and do more and more for you. So shadow work is not about eliminating anything in the shadow, but it may ultimately help to alleviate the ways that we are enacting in our world that are just keeping us from actually being ourselves, actually keeping us from actually being in real, authentic relationship. But shadow work itself is ultimately about integration. So, persona. This is Jung himself in the Collective Works. He says, the persona is oriented on the one hand by the expectations and demands of society, and on the other by the social aim and aspirations of the individual. So the persona in some ways is this intersection of how I want to be perceived and how the world wants to perceive me. And that's often where you'll find the persona most active, right? Because it's this crossroads of, okay, this is a part of me. This is a part of Michael that the world really likes. My environment loves that part of me. And if I get that sense, especially if you're in a context that's really averse to other parts of you, right? Well, you're just going to keep feeding that one particular part, right? And that is a persona, not a bad thing. It's a way in which we meet our world, but it can be such an over accentuation of who we are that we almost can't connect with the rest of us, right? And the rest of, the people around us only continue to feed that, and it leads towards alienation from, the fuller sense of who we are. So essentially, our persona is a face with which we meet our external environment, right? It helps us to communicate a portion or aspect of our personality, right? Of the ego. Okay. It helps us to communicate that part. Persona is an elevated and or an accentuated part of our personality. Again, it's not a false part. It's just something that we put out and accentuate in different scenarios. Okay. I'll make this point. We can have many different personas. We can have, we have our work persona. We have the persona that we have maybe when we're with kids. We have a persona that we have when we're with our kids, when we're with other people. I mean, I can find myself, just like that persona is all so instant. It's so unconscious, but like my face looks a certain way. I'm just kind of like, if the kids are fighting and I'm just so irritated. The minute someone walks up to our table and I can be like, especially if it's not someone I know that well, that persona of like the kind of loving, warm parent that I am is immediately on. Super forgiving, super understanding, where, 30 seconds ago, I was ready to take away all privileges of dessert and fun and pleasure for the foreseeable future. We have many different personas, okay? And personas are protective and adaptive. This is huge, right? So personas conceal certain parts, large portions of our personality, right? If we have a persona at work, especially if we're in a leadership role, well, that persona is helping us to conceal, in a good way, huge parts of our life, right? The same way that you would put on clothing, if it's negative 10 degrees outside, you're going to wear the right clothing for that environment. You're not going to wear what you would wear to the beach in August. So a persona is kind of like a protective layer that helps you to maintain a sense of identity without having to just like, spew out into the world. So it conceals that part. And it's also adaptive. The persona helps us to reveal certain parts of us, right? So if I love teaching. Personally, I love teaching. I love this kind of space. This is kind of odd because I'm recording it and there's no one here to interact with. So I'm having to imagine that I'm interacting with you all. But there's a persona that I have right now. I don't talk to my kids this way. I don't talk to my friends. If I'm sitting down over a beer, this is not how I engage. Maybe in some ways, but there's a certain way that the persona I'm in right now is helping to reveal something really important to me that I think is really important to you. And it is a persona that's actually giving me the conduit, the canal for that to actually move out into the world. So persona helps to protect us and helps us to adapt. It conceals and it reveals. Persona helps to function as a social lubricant, which I love, such a lubricant. What a word, right? So it kind of greases the wheels of our social environment. When you have someone who lacks a persona in a social setting, you feel it, right? Someone who just is inappropriately sharing, taking up all this space and talking about themselves all the time. Someone with a really, I'd say a persona that is lubricating is going to be someone who can talk about themselves, but who can also ask questions of other people. That's such an easy space to be in when you're around someone who is aware of that, right? Now, they may have a deep desire to talk about themselves, but that persona is helping them to engage this other half, which is that, yeah, but other people need to be able to talk about themselves. So you can see how the persona is also really essential. With our persona, we can become either over-identified or we can have an insufficient persona, right? So, you've got superhero here, and then you've got this person just kind of standing in shame and exposed, right? So the superhero has almost been taken over by this persona. right? We can live this way. We over-identify this one part of our personality that we present out into the world. The world loves it. We get so much affirmation. And if we really are, we don't have guides helping us to connect with our other parts, well, we can say, well, the persona seems to be helping me the most get all of my needs met. I feel, on fire when I'm in that. And so it can be very difficult to take it off. We have to stay in it in order to continue to get the affirmation and the accolades that the world has given us. And when I say the world, definitely this happens in religious spaces. So the world and the church kind of thing isn't a thing. Your social environment, right? It's the social environment that, if it is very affirming to a certain part of you, and then you over-identify with that part to the exclusion of vast other parts of you, that's when a persona has become over-identified. And then having an insufficient persona is just as big of an issue. I've worked with a number of clients who our work was not about, let's go dig up what is buried down deep. I mean, it's always a part of it, but it was about helping to cultivate a healthy persona, right? There can be this narrative, this collective expectation that your life is not yours. Your life should be, in service of something larger. This is particularly true in a lot of evangelical or Christian spaces, right? Your life is hidden with Christ, and it's no longer you who live, right? It's but Christ. And so we can develop this sense of like, well, anything that I accentuate in myself is actually me not living a holy life or living a life that is pleasing to God. And so I've encountered so many who simply have never developed a persona. Well, you still develop it, but it's like there's a persona of not having a persona. It's a persona of basically not being anything. And then that person can't accept any sort of compliments. It's like as soon as they do something good, they immediately bypass the feelings, emotions, and the affirmation by giving that goodness to God, right? Or, giving God the glory is how it's often posed. But the person never really experiences their own sense of goodness, right? Their own image of God within. They constantly deflecting. And though they might know at some level that they are good at something, they can't tolerate that feeling. They can't tolerate hearing or even sitting with the thought that they are good. And or for religious leaders that feel like their life is ministry, right? So they give, and there's not really anything that is helping to conceal the more sacred parts of their life, because it's like their whole life is lived in service of others. So building a sufficient persona can be just as important as integrating the depths of shadow. So this is an awareness journal moment. So you can feel free to pause here. I'm not going to go into much detail, but just pause here, take a moment to read through these questions, prompts, journal, and then come back when you're ready. So I want to jump into this term complex. So the basic definition of a complex is unconscious autonomous network of associations which carry a positive or negative emotional charge. Essentially, it's important to know that complexes, you've probably heard this term before, right? Oh, you have such a martyr complex or victim complex or oh, that's my father complex coming in again. So this is inherently Jungian. By the way, Jung developed this entire psychology. He almost called his psychological framework complex psychology. So this is core to Jungian theory. But ultimately, complexes are unconscious, right? They are not conscious. We are not aware of them. We can become aware of them. We become aware of how they are impacting us. But a complex is something that lives underneath the line, the water line of consciousness. And it's autonomous. It's an autonomous network of associations. So when someone says, I've got the victim kind of complex, oh, my victim complex was triggered. Well, if someone has a victim complex, it's because they have an unconscious network of associated experiences, symbols, images, people, whatever, that brought about this sense, this narrative that they are a victim, right? That they are not safe, that they are not wanted, that they are not going to get their needs met. And when that is unconscious, to the degree that it's unconscious, it will be equally autonomous. So you think about someone who's ever gone 0 to 60, right? This is the way we talk about this. So someone who was, you're fine, and then something triggered, and now you are blowing up at people. Okay. It's because that unconscious network, which was kind of lying dormant or lying in sleep, kind of like a dragon, gets awoken or wakened, whichever, and it has a life of its own and it can burn down everything. Right. But that's a negative example. So you can also have positive, right? Something gets triggered and you are infatuated with someone. You are over the top obsessed with this person or this community or this concept. And it has everything you've ever wanted, right? This can be another indication that, oh, a positive complex has been triggered and I'm now trapped. It's like I've lost myself. Everything I've ever wanted, needed, or aspired to is in that. And now I'm trapped kind of in this space. Complexes are formed through our personal experiences and tied to memories and become our templates for interpreting and responding to our environment. Okay. So they're not only formed through our experiences, they end up being the things through which we understand and interpret our current and future experiences, right? There are templates and they're the lenses through which we see interactions, right? If someone, you say hi to someone and they don't say hi back, what's the story you tell yourself in that moment? Do you immediately think, oh, they didn't hear me? Or do you immediately think they're ignoring me? They must hate me. They must have heard something about me. They must, where does your mind go? Because it's our complexes that ultimately give shape to how we interpret our world and respond, frankly. Because then what do you do with once you've decided that they are being rude and that they're ignoring you, what do you do? Do you avoid them? Do you never talk to them again? Do you confront them? You bring a proverbial gun to a knife fight and just get really angry and they're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea, but now I'm definitely not going to ever talk to you again because you just blew me up. I have been in both situations, frankly. So this term complex was actually came about as Jung observed clients. So what he would do is he had a word association test, and it was he just had like about 100 common words, right? So like table, car, spoon, chicken, or rooster, or whatever that is, broccoli. What are the things? He would say these words. They wouldn't have images. He would just say the word, and then the patient would say the first word that was associated with it, right? So if he said chair, they'd say table. If he said car, say road. Say spoon, you say cereal, or spoon, food. But like, if he said broccoli, and that maybe they had a delayed response. Took a minute to kind of what is broccoli? I don't know. Or had some sort of really odd association, right? Like broccoli and dad. It's an odd association. Or rhyming, car, bar, like, well, what was that, right? Perhaps a defense, right? So, the word car comes up and there's an immediate like, ooh, there's something there, but it's unconscious. And in order to not go there, you just rhyme. So Jung saw when there was kind of a delayed response or an odd association or rhyming, that sort of thing, he saw this as an unconscious defense to a psychological conflict that was happening inside of them. Okay. So the word brought about the conflict and their conscious mind wanted to defend against feeling that. So it brought forward something that was not a clear association or an easy association to make. So yeah, take a moment and look at these images. These 5 images here: chair, car, spoon, rooster, broccoli. Do any of them cause an emotional charge for you? Maybe none of them. But it's curious. If they do, it's worth looking at. How about these? Take a moment and feel in your body what comes up. So complexes are the organizing structures of our shadow. So we want to understand, how does this relate to other things we've talked about? You can think about complexes kind of living in this space. Okay. They make up a huge part of our unconscious life. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't make up part of our conscious, the ego is also known as an ego complex. It's a sense of, it's a grouping of associated qualities and attributes that we identify with. Yeah, so this is kind of what you can think of when you think about complexes, like locating them on the map. They're unconscious, and they are certainly, because they're part of the unconscious, they're in the unconscious, they really make up a lot of what the shadow is. The shadow is it's not just a bag full of loose leaf single items, but kind of like a bag full of clusters of associations. So a negative complex, actually, it orbits trauma or significantly bad experiences, right? Um, um, so when we encounter something related to that complex, we're triggered. This is what we mean when we say, "Oh yeah, I was triggered by that," or "They pushed my, she pushed my buttons," right? Something happened on the outside that constellated. This is the word that Jungians use, is a complex is constellated. It's activated. It's like energized and charged for action, right? Because something out here triggered this larger association, and now that complex has come online to act, to act. And when you think about, I'll go back here just a moment, right? So like if something happens in your outer life that triggers one of these complexes down in shadow, what'll often happen is that one of that single complex will suddenly dilate and become so big that it takes over the personality. And when that happens, it's as though, the rest of who you are isn't even there, right? It's like, oh, suddenly you're just this, right? You're just this person that's completely angry, full of rage, or you could be this person that suddenly like lost all sense of confidence. And now you're just like completely isolated and feel so small, right? These are, these are complexes taking over. And when a complex takes over, it typically will it's exactly what it does. It like can possess you. And I have an article on my column, Transgressive Spirituality, talk about like when we are possessed by a complex and what that is like. It is as though the rest of us isn't even there. It's that one part of us has martial law over the rest of our psyche. And it can be very intense. So this is kind of how trauma and negative complexes are formed, right? So I'll use the example for me, of a car. I have a car complex, which is also tied to like father complex. There's like a lot of things in there, right? Complexes are linked. So when I was a kid, I had a series of traumatic events. There was multiple car wrecks. I remember being in the car when my mom and dad were driving. My mom was quite pregnant, I think, at that time with my younger sister. And I just remember, police lights and airbags and all these things surrounding that event. But there were multiple wrecks. And then there was moments of road rage. I remember my dad getting so angry and tailgating someone on the interstate. And it felt like we were going 100 miles an hour. I don't know, but we were in the back seat, just like me and my sister were just absolutely like, what's going to happen, and that heightened sense of awareness, right? It's also traumatic. But then when I was 15, 16, learning how to drive, and I didn't know how to navigate. I've never been good with directions. I love the map of the soul, but when it came to like understanding like actual roads, I was actually completely hopeless. And I was told that. I was told, oh, you can't find your way out of a wet paper bag or whatever or something. And that hit so deep, and I felt emasculated and I felt stupid. And then it just made me feel more lost, which just affirmed the complex more and just fed that, right? We experience those kinds of traumas, certainly trauma around a similar area over the course of time, we will enter into what's called psychic splitting, right? So psychic splitting is a defense mechanism to protect our ego, right? A sense of who we are, our identity, so that it can function without the overwhelming experience of all that pain, right? So we split, this is unconscious, we don't know we're doing it, in order to essentially section off or quarantine this part of us that feels diseased, that feels unacceptable, and that frankly is not helping us and may even be harming us. Okay. And I will say, as a kid, I needed, like, there's a certain sense of like, I kind of needed to split. Like, this is not only a defense mechanism, it's kind of an essential thing. If you aren't able to split, like if I wasn't able to split from the sense that I am really like, I'm really bad at driving, I'm really bad at directions, I likely would not have developed the things that I was good at, because I would have been so overwhelmed by the reality of how bad I felt about this other stuff, right? It was like too much shame. So in some ways, I was able to kind of push the shame aside. You could even say throw it in the bag or throw it behind me. And I needed it to move through high school, to move to play soccer, to have the confidence to get a scholarship in college and play there. I needed this splitting to help me move towards graduate school and get my master's and ultimately get my doctorate and ultimately be here doing this. Yes, so it's necessary. But yes, we split these parts of us off. And ultimately, that's when the complex forms. So it's like you send all that stuff, you section it off, but it doesn't just stay there like inanimate objects. No, they start to form alliances and organize around this common goal. I mean, you can think about this on a macro level, right? When there is anything that has to do with like an authoritarian government oppressing people, those people are not just going to be like, okay, cool, I guess we don't have any power. No, they're going to go and actually like fight back. I mean, we're seeing this in Israel and Palestine right now. As I write this, I mean, we're right in the middle of, well, I don't, hopefully we're getting somewhere. I don't know. But that's what we're seeing, is an oppressive regime that is essentially cutting people off, depriving them of integration of any kind, and they're revolting, and they're not gonna stop. And that's exactly what happens psychologically. It's exactly what we do psychologically, is that we think, oh, if I can just like get rid of that, and we don't think this is unconscious again, but if I can get rid of that, then I will have the life I really want. But ultimately, we need that wholeness. It's about the wholeness that comes together. When the complex forms and it goes into that, it stays in that unconscious space, we then just continue to have experiences that only confirm and build and strengthen the complex. And because it's not conscious, we can't interact with these triggers. We can't interact with the buttons that get pushed. So we start to avoid them, which only really strengthens the complex, right? It's like, well, the complex is right. The complex is like, yeah, you shouldn't go there. Yeah, you shouldn't. And this is where the complex becomes autonomous, right? It starts to live a life of its own. It's so cut off and quarantined from our everyday waking life that it starts to live a life of its own. Okay. And when it lives a life of its own, it will dictate so much of what we do in our waking life, right? If I have a car complex where there's so much trauma, and I have a car complex, and when there's so much trauma associated with that, it can affect whether I drive, where I drive. It certainly affects how I drive. Some of the most intentional, focused inner work I have to do happens when I'm driving, or when I'm about to drive, or when I've just got done driving, because that complex wants to take over and wants to say everyone's out to get you, everyone's here to hurt you, everyone thinks you're stupid. So I'm having to get to know those voices, because they got split off and I never really got to know them. I warred with them for years until I realized they're just trying to protect me. And that's what, I mean, it ultimately comes back to this kind of befriending the complex and getting to know, okay, how is it showing up? How is it messing up and ruining my life, even at some level? And once we're here, right, once the complex has become autonomous, we are susceptible to hypersensitivity, constantly being triggered or being kind of on edge of being triggered. And this will lead to what we could call arrested development, right? If we're so dominated in our lives by a certain complex, we will not progress forward in our just natural maturation of life. We will avoid core, key developmental tasks because it's too painful. Finding secure attachment, moving forward with my work, in my career, my job, leaving my job. I'm done with this. If I have a failure complex, well, leaving something that's unhealthy, that doesn't bring me life, is not even something that's helping the world really be a better place. I hate my boss. I don't like anyone I work with. If we have a failure complex, we may stay in that far too long, or a martyr complex, right? Like, oh, my life, this is what it is to be a good person, is to do things that you hate. That could be a guiding narrative. But the same is true that we can avoid actually being successful and moving towards our authentic, godlikeness in the world, because that's wrong. If your God complex is one that is almost egotistical and narcissistic, right? Everything's about him, and everything that you do is ultimately comes back to him. If that's your God image, you're not going to grow up. You're going to stay a child until you die. And I have seen this happen many times, 60, 70, 80-year-old people functioning like children. And they have cut everyone off because ultimately they never grew up, and everyone grew beyond them. You could say it and point it back to how they're this really, really core complex around their God image, which is also connected to parental complexes, basically was so massive and so consuming in their unconscious that it basically eviscerated their ability to live life. So here are some more questions for an awareness journal. So feel free to pause and take a moment and read through those, journal them out, take as long as you want, come back to this, and we'll pick back up. So I want to touch on archetypes real quick. You've probably heard this term thrown around in different places, but I want to give a kind of an overview. So definitionally, archetypes, a great definition is they're the universal, instinctual, and unseeable patterns in the collective unconscious, right? That shape human thought, behavior, and experiences across culture and time. So if we think back to the map, right, the green space outside of the white sphere, that is the realm of the archetypes, right? We can't actually be them, engage them, or we can't be them. We can't integrate them. We can relate to them, right? They can relate to us. We can't fully embody an archetype. You'll see things on social media like, oh, what's your archetype? As though it's like a personality test or something. And it's just not helpful. What's helpful is understanding that fear or anger are archetypes, right? You can't, but you can't even really say those are archetypes, because we just use words to define what those archetypes were: fear and anger, which words are made up of letters, which are symbols, which are communicating the things that we can't really even communicate. That's what the archetype is. It's the thing that we can't see that animates everything that we do and engage in, right? So when I say warrior, you had an image of a warrior probably come into your mind, okay? That is what you just encountered wasn't the archetype, but the image of the archetype, okay? It was an image of an archetypal energy that we call warrior. And these archetypes are universal. They span time, culture, right? The archetype of spirituality, the archetype of government. And they're all imaged differently, but humans organize themselves archetypally across the board. Even if you want to be like in an anarchist kind of space where there isn't any structure, well, there's going to be structure to the lack of structure. People are going to organize themselves. So it's just something that cannot be avoided. Archetypes are a priori, right? They are from the beginning. They just are. Okay. So archetypes, maybe just make this connection between archetypes and negative complexes. So negative complexes form around wounds, but a more accurate thing to say is they form around a wounded archetype, right? So an example would be a wounded mother archetype is the core of a negative mother complex. So if your experiences, again, what's a mother archetype? It's only, you can't experience the mother archetype. You can only experience it through your experiences with people who embody that energy of mother. That could be your actual biological mother, a stepmother, a grandmother, someone who had energy that was like a mother, like the mother of a friend. It can be formed by how you as a mother engage, right? Or how you engaged and you feel really shameful about, or how you engaged and you don't want to look at that. Like, I don't want to look at how I was with my kids when they were younger, whatever. But a wounded mother archetype is the core of that negative mother complex. And so the way that we start to heal a negative mother complex is starting to look at our experiences with the archetypal energy through the people experiences that we've had, right? That energized and communicated that archetype. By the way, the etymology of the word trauma is Greek and it means wound, right? So when what we're dealing here with when we talk about trauma is ultimately this wound, and in this case, the wounded archetypal core. There's so much to say about archetypes, but for our purposes, archetypes are the core of negative complexes. So I just want you to remember that, right? So, for example, the mother archetype is the core of the mother complex. Complexes orbit this wounded archetypal core. And the mother archetype is the animating factor of your experiences with images that embody the mother archetype, right? So if you have a negative mother complex and then become a mother, it's going to be some of your deepest work to address the ways in which you act and engage as a mother, right? And now some, if they have a negative mother complex, will become unconsciously, they'll just become exactly like their mother was, right? If their mother was neglectful and abusive, they could do that very thing. But the other thing, I've seen this happen many times when someone is slightly conscious of a negative mother complex, like, oh, my mother was like that. I don't want to be anything like her. I'm going to do the opposite. So, that person goes from being, neglected as a child to as a parent, they are over involved, right? And too invested. And the child, instead of having this massive amount of space where they weren't seen, heard, or talked to, now they are so engaged that child can't really have autonomy and grow into themselves. And so then that child really never gets to grow up. And so you see here how the negative mother complex actually impacted in an opposite way how that mother enacted, right? Because again, it was the mother complex that drove them to overcompensate instead of actually finding a place of like, I can be both. Like archetypes, by the way, are bivalent, right? They are polarized and there's like a spectrum. So you can have a negative and a positive. And so when someone has a negative experience with that archetype, there's this natural desire to try to balance it out and not balance it, but actually switch to the other side. But really, ultimately, it is about balance. It's about addressing this negative, and it's about integrating more of the positive and finding this place where you can actually experience the full range. And in experiencing the full range, you aren't constantly reacting in this polarized way, but you can kind of live in the in-between. Just as another example here, complexes, again, they orbit this archetypal core. So if the masculine archetype, archetype of masculine is wounded, it's going to be wounded through your experiences with, say, your dad or other men that were in your life, coaches, teachers, but it will certainly impact how you interact with your boss if your boss is male. right? I personally can, I remember when I had a boss, maybe there's my own complex. I don't have a boss anymore. Probably, I wonder why. Don't like it. But there's a sense that when I had male bosses, I was so wildly concerned all the time if they thought I was doing a good job. Their judgments felt so overwhelming at times. And there was no data, there was nothing they were saying. It was just literally, I started from a place of, I am a piece of shit, I'm not good enough, and I have to overcompensate and be almost like this shadow of who I really am, or a persona really, or this like very narrow presentation of who I am in order to get their acceptance. And if they were ever upset with me, I was like, it was untenable to feel that. It's funny because with a female boss, I never felt that. With a female boss, I always felt like I was sufficient. I always felt like I was enough. It wasn't because I felt that way around my mom, but in some ways I felt like an equal. Which the story of that is, with my mom, I never really felt like she was in authority over me. Frankly, I always felt like we were equals because I was there for her during some of our darkest times, and I didn't really feel like she was a mother as much as a co-sufferer. Okay. So when I had female bosses, that mother complex was there and it was helping me to feel really accepted. But on the other hand, I didn't really learn much either because I did not see it as a space that was for learning as much as it was for taking care of people and taking care of my boss even, right? Whereas my male boss, I actually felt like I was constantly lesser than. I would even imagine myself like I'm shorter and smaller. Whereas with a female boss, I would feel, oh, we're the same height. I mean, literally in my imagination, I would think like this. That can be a really good indicator, by the way. Like, who are the people when you close your eyes and you imagine them? Who are the people that feel like they are bigger than you, who are more powerful than you? And that could be because they actually are, they have more power, or it could be because there's something psychologically inside that's telling you that you are less, that you are not as good, that you are not enough, that you need to hide and become small. So, healing the archetypal core of complexes. How do we do this? So first, there's an awareness of the complex rather than isolated experiences. So exploring emotions, memories, and reactions. Okay, so in order to heal a complex, we have to be aware of it, and we can't go searching into the dense dark forest of our soul trying to find what's not healed. You'll find it if you just watch your life, right? Like knowing how you are reacting to the people around you, to certain thoughts or categories of thought. What do you avoid? What do you cross the proverbial street to not have to engage? I hate dealing with money. I hate finances. I want to just be unaware that that's even a thing, right? I have a money complex. Money is something that caused a lot of problems as a child, and I kind of internalized the sense that money equaled unhappiness. Money equaled lack of safety. And you couple that with my evangelical upbringing, and it's like, well, you shouldn't have money either. You're like, that should be given away. And so it was always really uncomfortable to have money, to be saving. Like that felt bad to even save money, frankly. So notice those stories you tell yourself, the memories that you have around those things, the emotions that come about, and then start to investigate, like start making little connections like, oh, there's this. Oh, yeah, there's all these little moments where this has come about. And then seeking safe, intentional engagement with the positive pole of the archetype. So if you find that you have a negative, well, we'll stick with the money piece, right? You have a negative money complex. Well, that's because you encountered kind of that pole of the archetype, the money archetype, if you will, right? You encountered the negative pole of that. So engaging in very safe, sustainable, developmentally appropriate ways of engaging, that's a great step, right? So what's something small you can do to engage with money, right? You don't have to switch to the other side. It doesn't need to be like, now I'm like, CPA of my life. No, like you can take little steps to like, what if I made a spreadsheet and budgeted out my expenses every month and what I feel like I need to make in order to live, in a way that, and then how do I maybe increase what I can spend over the course of time? Like, how do I make more money? How do I open up maybe a high yield savings account that gives me $20-$30 every month just because I have money in there? Like little things that can actually move you, and that may even sound overwhelming, like little ways that can move you towards interacting with that positive pole. Same would be true of like, a mother or father complex. How can you engage with other images or, when I say images, people or spaces that embody that archetype? How can you engage in those ways, in ways that are safe and very intentional, that are positive and aren't going to re-trigger, but you can be aware of those triggers and step into them? That's where individual shadow work, by the way, can be so wildly important, so helpful in unearthing some of those things and experimenting with possible ways of integrating. Awareness of the complex rather than isolated experiences. So one of the ways that I've seen people bypass dealing with a complex is they'll say, I don't know what got into me back there. That completely came out of nowhere. Oh yeah, that was just, I lost my control for a second, right? That is just whatever. And so they'll isolate the experience. Oh, that was just like a one-off experience that I just had. But it might be that if it was a really intense thing, you may be experiencing this every few months, maybe just every few years, but it's always really big. And so coming to a point where you're like, actually, there's an association happening unconsciously that I need to address. It's not just this one-off thing, because there's like one-off things every few months. I need to address this as a larger system. It's a system of something rather than like one thing that you don't need to really look much. Oh, I'm better now. Because anytime a complex comes, it feels overwhelming, but it eventually leaves and you feel better until it is activated again. So I think that is, identifying that this is actually an association of experiences as opposed to single one-off experiences will help you to address, moving forward and identifying the complex. Okay. So we're going to talk, finish up here talking about the self. So the self. We hear this term all the time, self-awareness, right? We talk about the true self. In internal family systems, they use the term the self, which I think aligns pretty well with the Jungian definition of the self. But for us, we can think of the self as essentially the center and circumference of who we are. It is both the core and the essence and the totality of who we are in all things in some ways. I mean, it's really all encompassing. Jung said this, he says, to this day, and this is really what he means by the self. He says, to this day, God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path, violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. So I would encourage you to maybe reflect on this one, right? Because this is a very different understanding of, a God image that's just full of light and full of, just wants nothing but good things for you, right? And that's very comforting, and that we need that. And yet again, we go back to the archetype, right? Archetypes are bivalent. There's the positive and negative poles. And just as it's not healthy to live constantly on the negative, it's certainly not good to live constantly on the positive. It's about the ability to move between. Because if our God complex, we could say, if our understanding of how God works and who God is constantly just full of light, well, again, that's going to cast quite a big shadow. If we think our God image is full of darkness and suspicion, that's going to cast a large shadow, and we're going to put a lot of our light there. We're going to hide huge illuminating parts of who we are from this unpredictable God image. And I think this is why the classic, classic's not even the right word, the evangelical understanding of God is really bankrupt and insufficient at this point, because if we understand the self, the center and the circumference of who we are, right? It's the imago Dei within, it's the image of God in us, but it's also the divine presence in and all around us, right? If we understand that as the thing that's upsetting my willful path, it is ultimately the inner opposite of the ego that actually is bringing about a greater sense of wholeness, right? My willful path, we could say, is the path that the ego would choose. And the self works to disrupt that and change and transform. And the ego will oftentimes experience that as violence, as reckless, as upsetting. But ultimately, it's moving. And we may even say, this has changed my life for the worse. But that again is an ego perspective, because the self, this is core to Jungian psychology, that the self is ultimately bringing about wholeness. So our God image, our image of the divine, must continue to evolve to one that is bringing about wholeness. And from an ego perspective, that is not always going to look like wholeness, but it's going to be moving that direction. I'm speaking specifically to those of us, if you're like me, that grew up in an environment that the God image was very one-sided, very perfectionistic, seemed quite concerned with every thought that you had that may not have been good, every judgment you had about someone, every selfish desire you had, and you had to get rid of all of that. The ego can identify as like, well, I'm a really good person. The rich young ruler, I tithe, everything I have, 10% of everything I have. I've kept the commandments since I was young. And, and Jesus in that story says, well, one thing you lack, you're quite wealthy, go sell your possessions and give them to the poor. And that man in this story went away sad because he had great wealth. And, Jesus in this scene is an image of the self, violently and recklessly upsetting this man's willful path. He wants to be really, really good. And Jesus says, it's actually about being whole. It's not about being good. And that's a whole different spirituality if we're aimed towards wholeness rather than goodness. Meister Eckhart, in a book called Into the Heart of the Feminine, is quoted. He says, when the soul wishes to experience something, she throws an image of the experience out before her and enters into her own image. Okay, so the self is ultimately bringing about wholeness. Okay. Ultimately, that's what it's about. And in order to do that, it's going to be connecting our conscious self to the unconscious self. And in order to do that, it has to bring out those unconscious aspects, traits, experiences, and put them out here, right? That put them out before us. And then it's as though we are drawn to them. So if you find yourself drawn to something that feels like completely not how you thought you were, how you imaged or imagined yourself, if you are drawn to something that feels transgressive to your ego identity, how people will see you, but you can't deny the drawing, you can't deny the charge that you feel towards it, it's time to get curious, because it's very likely that the self is trying to cast something very essential to you out in front of you so that you will move into it and ultimately integrate it. The self and the evangelical God, if we want to think about these two things sitting down, talking to each other, the evangelical God would crucify the self. Let me sit with that for a second. The evangelical God would crucify self. And does, and always has, and always will in many ways, literally and metaphorically. I mean, Jesus, if we think about Jesus as an image of the self, right? The one that brings about wholeness. Well, that wholeness was not tolerated by the highly one-sided, calcified image of God and how God would show up, right? And ultimately, that's what got Jesus crucified, was that he was bringing about a sense of wholeness to a people who wholeness was threatening. Wholeness required them to look at people and engage really painful thoughts about themselves and others that it would just be easier just to keep repressing, right? But Jesus is like, no, you're going to bring forward the least of these. You're going to, care for the stranger outside of you and within you. And that is not acceptable to that collective ego. And that just happens time and time again. So what is it that feels transgressive, right? What is it that feels like if I move into that, I'm transgressing something? It may be, and this is where having a guide, having someone to walk with you is so beneficial, but you may need someone to walk with you through that. So, what is it that feels like I can't go there, but I can't not go there? That is usually the drawing of the self, pulling you into greater wholeness. So to kind of bring this back together, the self is the archetype of wholeness. So when you think about your God image, when you think about a sense of, what is it that's moving me into this, more into myself, that's the self with a capital S, right? Again, center and circumference of all that we are. It's both the conscious and the unconscious. And it is our image of God. And it's also the Imago Dei. And it's the energy the archetypal energy that animates our God images. Our God image will continue to be crucified, buried, and then be risen or raised again into a new form. It has to. We can't have the same God image we had when we were 6. If you're still trying to hang on to that kind of God image, you're likely doing a disservice and being untruthful to your own actual experience. Someone asked me recently, well, my image of God has always been Father. And, when they were young, it was Father, and now, middle-aged, and God's still a Father. And I'm like, well, okay, that could be if you're an actual son or daughter of an actual father, your relationship with your actual father, even if he's like, say he's all good and wonderful, it evolves, right? You don't have the same relationship as a child when you're 6 with your father that you do when you're 60. That relationship shifts and changes, right? And the same is true of our God image. If you primarily are connecting with God through a parental image, well, that image, if you try to keep God as this kind of all benevolent father, grandfather figure, and you continue to see yourself as a child, like an actual developmentally in that space, you are stunting your own growth. And that is no longer serving a sense of wholeness, but actually is reaffirming a sense of splitness. And that is what a lot of people do with their God image, is that their God image, if it doesn't evolve, it continues to just sustain the split. That's why Jesus was crucified. First century Jews seeing Jesus as a threat, right? As a threat to the split, as opposed to an actual healer and whole maker. Okay, I think we're going to pause there. There is the anima and animus piece. I'm going to offer that in a future course. I will say this, that ultimately the anima or animus, if we want to go to this slide here, you can see that it's kind of a mirror opposite of the persona, right? So if the persona is the face with which we meet our external world, the anima or animus is that which helps us meet our internal world. So the anima or animus is kind of our inner opposite. It's kind of a part of the self in some ways that helps to meet the parts of us that have been cut off. So if we are, I'm a man, I identify as a man, my ego is very male-centered, my persona is very masculine presenting. Well, my inner opposite is going to be more of the feminine, right? There's going to be more of a feminine quality there, and ultimately a lot of feminine qualities or traditionally feminine qualities that are unconscious. And so my anima, because as a man I will have an anima, that's, the idea is that masculine presenting people will have an inner feminine anima, feminine presenting individuals will have an animus, inner masculine. But my anima helps to introduce me to the parts of me that are cut off in the ego forming process. So that's a whole other thing. We encounter them in dreams. So if you have an image in your dream that is opposite gender, opposite sex, and you don't know who they are, like it's not clear that, it could be someone but If it's like almost like this ethereal person, chances are you're dealing with an anima or animus. And now it's time to pay attention. Like, what do they do? Like, what do they show you? What do they lead you into? And that's where dream work and active imagination really comes in. Okay, everyone. I want to thank you for listening. Listen as many times as you want. If you'd like to reach out to me, all my information is on my website. Feel free to reach out and connect for one-on-one sessions or look for future opportunities to engage. Okay, we'll talk soon. Take care.